Buenas tardes, le habla Manuel Frau Ramos, editor del Sol Latino. Estamos grabando hoy, 17 de marzo del 2021, el episodio número 47 de Podcast 413. Desde el oeste de Massachusetts, mejor conocido como el Pioneer Valley. Con nosotros siempre, nuestra colega de Holyoke Media, Natalia Muñoz. Bueno, y damos la introducción de lo que viene en los próximos episodios y voy a adelantarme y decir que en abril nos vamos con deporte. Las primeras dos entrevistas van a ser los organizadores de las ligas de softball de Holyoke, de Springfield, de los Old Timers. Y que ya son clásicas en esta área. Y después cogeremos a dos artistas puertorriqueños, una de bomba y plena, de la familia Cepeda, y otro, un tallador de madera, de Tres Reyes Magos, para que nos hablen cómo han sobrevivido en este año de la pandemia, cómo culturalmente han podido sobrevivir. Bueno, y hoy tenemos a una vieja amiga originalmente estaba en Boston, pero ahora está en el sur, en Atlanta. De hecho, los otros días entrevistamos a Carmen Rivera sobre el libro del Partido Socialista Puertorriqueño, A este lado del charco, que acaba de salir. Y Mariana Rivera nos va a hablar de su libro junto con... ¿Quién es la otra? Margaret Randall. El libro que se publicó el año pasado, pero por razones obvias no se pudo promocionar. Dominga Rescues the Flag, Dominga Rescata la bandera. Welcome, Mariana Mcdonald, to our program.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be here, and I'm really thrilled to have the chance to share Dominga's story with you as we approach the 84th anniversary of the horrific Massacre de Ponce that took place on March 21st, 1937. So.
Okay, let's begin. Who is Dominga?
Dominga de la Cruz.
Who, in the history of the independence movement, who is Dominga de Jesus?
Dominga de la Cruz Becerril was a Black working class Puerto Rican woman born April 22nd, 1909 in Ponce, Puerto Rico. And she was born just in that period when of entrenchment and consolidation of the U.S. colonial control of Puerto Rico. And she was born 11 years after the invasion in 1898. And Dominga was, again, she was a Black woman. She was born into the extreme poverty and hardship that blanketed the whole island at that time. And this poverty affected her very personally and directly. Her two daughters died of malnutrition. And this caused her as a thinking young woman to question why this was happening. And for that reason, she began to search for answers, and she began to hear about Pedro Albizu Campos, and she was very much drawn to him and to the Nationalist Party as a way of addressing the horrible conditions that she and her family had suffered. And so the story of Dominga is, to me, it's the story of Puerto Rican resistance, because what she did, she became an activist in the party, and despite the fact that many didn't respect her necessarily as a woman and also as a Black woman, I'm sure. But she just forged ahead, and she insisted. I mean, she showed up at the party office at the end of 1933, and she was, at that time, she was just a little over 24 years old, and she says, sign me up. So she was a remarkably brave and brilliant young woman, and she became very active in the party. She began writing things for, party propaganda and so forth, and she began to organize around women's issues. And she got to meet Albizu, and she was very taken with him, and he was taken with her, and she became his protege, essentially. And she was the one who gave him the apodo El Maestro. She was the one who first called him that, and it stuck, of course. She was part of the group of protesters who on March 21st, 1937, decided to protest the imprisonment of, it was Albizu Campos, Juan Antonio Correger, had been imprisoned under the charge of seditious conspiracy, which of course is the charge they used against Oscar López Rivera as well. So the nationalists called a protest for Ponce that Sunday. It was Palm Sunday, and it was to protest the imprisonment of the leaders and to commemorate also the end of slavery, the prior century. And there was an island-wide ban on demonstrations, and I'll back up on that in a second. Mm-hmm. And the mayor of Ponce granted a permit, but he reneged on it just moments before the march was to start, on the orders of General Winship, the governor of the U.S. appointed governor of Puerto Rico. And what was happening at that time was, as others have written about, is that basically there was a war against the nationalists that had been started by Winship and put into action by Colonel Riggs, who was responsible for the murders of nationalists at Rio Piedras in, I believe it was the fall of 1934. So there had been a great deal of repression and attacks on the nationalists, and the U.S. installed government made it crystal clear that they were going to do anything they could to get rid of the nationalists.
Okay, let's go back to the Rio Piedra massacre. What happened there?
Well, there was an outright attack on a group of, just trying to see if I have my text on it.
Students.
A group of protesters, nationalists, and several people were killed, including a passerby. And in retaliation for that, two nationalists decided they would track down and kill Riggs, which they did. And then those two were brought to the police station and summarily executed without any kind of anything. So there was a tremendous climate of repression and brutal violence against the nationalists. That was the context in which all demonstrations had been banned, across the country. So, but the nationalists decided, no, we're going to go ahead no matter what. We're not going to be intimidated. And later I'll read you a passage from the book, which I just want to show people what the book looks like. Okay, it's a beautiful. This is from a 1973 Ostball poster, by the way. The cover was designed by Jane Norling, who also designed that poster in Cuba in 1973. So anyway, they decided to go ahead and as I said, in a bit I'll read you a passage from that. And the forces of the U.S. repressive colonial machine just unfolded an all-out attack on the demonstrators, and for about 15 minutes, they were shooting with all manner of weapons, including machine guns, and apparently they used bullets that had been innovated by Mussolini, a certain kind of bullet that would explode inside the person. And one of those bullets actually literally tore apart a little girl who was killed. And this went on, just incredible gunfire. And there were people who had just come out of church that Palm Sunday. There were people who were passersby, and the demonstrators. And it was a horrific situation. And when it was all over, there were, at least 20 people dead and 200 people wounded, and just an extraordinary traumatic shock to anyone who has a sense of respect for peace and justice, no? And in the middle of that gunfire, a person who was carrying the flag near Dominga was shot and killed.
That is the Puerto Rican flag.
The Puerto Rican flag, yes. That person was shot and killed and fell to the ground. And Dominga had just, she had managed, she said, I don't know how I didn't get killed, but she hadn't been killed at that moment. But she saw the flag on the ground. And one of the teachings of Albizu was, you must never let the flag fall to the ground, which of course he meant both literally and figuratively, no? And so here she is in the middle of just this incredible barrage of gunfire, and she stops what she's doing and she goes to retrieve the flag, and she picks it up, and she says, I picked it up and went on with it. And for that extraordinary moment of bravery, she won both a place in history, which is documented in her story in this book, but she also, unsurprisingly, won a life of exile, persecution, repression. So she had to leave Puerto Rico within a few years. She went to Mexico. She lived and worked there many years, but then repression got heavy there, and she had to leave. Mexico, and she ended up living in Cuba, which of course embraced her with open arms, as Cuba is the other wing of the two wings. And there she lived until she died. And I had the great pleasure and honor of meeting her in the late 70s when I was in Cuba for the 11th World Festival of Youth and Students. I was there as a journalist, and I had met Margaret Randall a year or so before, and she knew I was coming. She knew I was involved in things having to do with Puerto Rico. And so she said, would you like to go meet Dominga? And of course I said yes. So meeting Dominga was truly magical. Trying to find the notes I wanted to share with you on that.
Well, while you look for the notes, I just want to point out for people who don't know, when your reference to Cuba as the other wing, that's a quote from Jose Marti, that Puerto Rico and Cuba are wings of the same bird.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah.
The more you know.
So I got to meet Dominga. So we went to her apartment in Vedado, and you know, we talked about a lot of things. Compañera Isabelita Rosado had been taking care of Dominga, who suffered from a number of health issues, just from having basically lived a total life of struggle without stopping, right? One of the things that was really quite wonderful is she told us about her visit with Andres Figueroa Cordero, who was there as a special guest of the festival. And also he was there in Havana for treatment. And she said that she had gone to see him. She'd gone to visit Andres. And at the same time, Fidel was there visiting Andres. And she says, imagine that, you know, in her typically wonderful, unaffected way. And she was so thrilled to share that story, which I think is a great story. Well,
for people who don't know, please tell us about Andres Figueroa.
Yes, Andres Figueroa Cordero is one of the 5 nationalist heroes from the 1954 attack on Congress, which we just commemorated a couple of weeks ago, which was planned and led by Lolita Lebron as an action that would call world attention to the situation in Puerto Rico, because there had been armed uprisings in Puerto Rico in 1950, which the U.S. crushed every way it could, including by bombing Jayuya, one of the leading sites of the insurrection. And so there had been this, you know,
Jayuya is a town in the mountains of Puerto Rico.
Right. And the uprising had been written off by the U.S. press as local riots or something like that. And so the Nationalist Party in New York decided they had to, you know, take some action to gain some attention. And so Andres Figueroa Cordero was one of those 4 who were involved in the action at Congress. And these were individuals who, along with Oscar Callazo, were political prisoners for over 25 years. And the campaign to win their freedom was a key aspect, a key part of the struggle around Puerto Rican independence and freedom in the 70s in particular.
And so it was then President Clinton who offered a pardon, and they accepted.
Right, that was no, it was Carter rather.
Carter, right? Thank you. Thank you.
Later. Yes, it was Carter, and so they were released in 1979. Unfortunately, Andres Figueroa Cordero had not contracted, but he had cancer in prison, which of course was not properly dealt with. So he was seriously ill, and that's why he was in Cuba for treatment. He passed away in 1979, I believe. But he is loved as a leader, and my son is named after him. So,
Mariana, say hello to your cat over there in the corner.
Your cat is saying, I am not a cat. I am not a cat.
That is so funny. Yeah. She's not a cat. No, she's
listening to the interview.
She's Luna.
Luna. Okay. Hello, Luna.
Thank you, Mariana, for bringing that full circle. El encuentro between the meeting between Dominga and Andres in Cuba. And yes, as someone like Dominga, yes, people who have had a lifetime of struggle, of trauma, of course, they're going to have a lot of health issues.
Yeah.
That's recorded evidence throughout the
exactly.
ages. And there's something about Dominga that is really moving to me, is that here she's a young girl in the middle of, I cannot imagine what it's like to be in the middle of a massacre. That you're being, just people are being shot, they're falling, their bodies being ripped. And it's the authorities, quote unquote. It's the people who are supposed to protect you. It's other Puerto Ricans also who are doing this.
Right.
So, and she has the courage to go to pick up the very thing that got all the other people shot.
Right.
I mean, that is such courage. Just a note to the millennials who cannot deal with, I don't know, just, I mean, nothing against the generation, but it's just, there's just something about having that kind of courage. We live in a culture of canceling people out because we love everything about them except they did this one thing that we can't stand, therefore throw them out.
Right.
No, people are complicated, people evolve. This young woman was far more evolved. And what a presence of mind, what courage. And I'm so glad that you have rescued her story.
Yeah, now I take from there. When you talk about the independence movement in Puerto Rico, the name of Dominga is not there.
Well, right. Unfortunately, and that was one of the things that she said to Margaret and me when we talked to her in that day in summer 1978. This book has been a long time coming, I have to tell you. Is she actually, she said, we have had to struggle for our right to struggle as women, because originally on that day of the massacre, they had said, oh no, you women should stay back. And they said, no, we're not staying back. No way, and finally they let them march, but they were originally not going to let the women march because there was, that patriarchal, patronizing view was very much alive then. And yet there were many brave young women who she marched with, and several women were killed among those who were slaughtered that day.
Well, and that's a flaw also in the pro-independence movement from day one. They're the only party that's like that extols freedom, independence, the right to be, and yet historically they keep women down. When Oscar López was here, I asked him about that.
Yeah.
Freedom, but freedom for who? You can talk about freedom for Puerto Rico, but it's populated by men and women. And what about the women in the movement? The one that we know so well, of course, is Lolita Lebrón, as we should. But there's so many others that we don't know, and then that we're starting to know, thanks then to the job that you have done with this book. Because liberation is not about geography, it's about humanity. And I'm so glad, again, I can't wait to read your book, Mariana.
In fact, the fact that she's woman and Black complicate everything, no? Because Black in the independence movement basically is the second class guy.
Exactly.
If you look at the PSP, Partido Independentista Puertorriqueño, just one.
It wasn't until now in Puerto Rico, for example, that this party that just formed a mere, just a year ago, or so.
Victoria Ciudadana.
Exacto. That women were leading the ticket.
Yeah.
For governor, for senator, for representative. Finally, 2020.
Yeah, no, it's a long-standing, I mean, the problems of ignoring women's contribution are historic, and the problems of ignoring the contributions of Afro descendants is also, I mean, people don't acknowledge Albizu was Black. So the legacy of Afro descendant leadership in the Puerto Rican independence movement is long and includes our beloved Albizu, includes Dominga, includes many others who are just beginning to get, acknowledged. So
I just have to say, Albizu is not my beloved, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah. Okay. That's
but
fine.
I get what you're saying. Yeah.
You know, I mean, and so, but what we're seeing happening in Puerto Rico, I think it's part of the worldwide movement that finally is coming together and just demanding an end to systemic racism and white supremacy. So, you know,
yeah, I just want to explain a little bit more. My grandmother was a follower also, a comrade of Albizu. Also, my grandmother was from Naguabo, on the eastern part of the island, and she was a young woman. He was bewitched by her. My grandmother had that ability, and my great grandmother told my grandmother, "Be careful, because there's violence in that man." And my grandmother wanted independence, not through violence, though. And so those are two. You know, it's the argument of the ages across colonized nations. Do we fight for this violently through violence? Do we fight for this peacefully? And my grandmother was from the faction that said, let's not bring even more violence. And so she eventually left the party. And also Albizu Campos was a tremendous misogynist. It just was, you know, he was that classic, women are the purpose of women is to have children, and that's it. And so it's hard. And I know I'm looking at this through a lens from the 21st century or the 20th century, the late 20th century. But it's hard for me as a woman to look at historical figures who, had I been alive in that time, would have worked towards my oppression, as if I weren't oppressed enough already. But that wasn't my grandmother's issue. My grandmother's issue was she did not believe in violence. And as we know, Albizu Campos promoted violence. He thought that violence was the only way to achieve independence for Puerto Rico.
Well, I think the massacre at Ponce clearly demonstrates the principal source of violence in Puerto Rico.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I'm not arguing that at all. No,
Okay.
that definitely was the colonizers wanting to suppress people through violence. There's no question about that.
Okay, I have a historical question. Why was organized in Ponce, non San Juan, in Mayagüez? Why Ponce?
Well, probably because that's where Albizu is from, and it was a stronghold of the party. Beyond that, I'm not sure. You know, San Juan has become all that, you know, in modern times, but it wasn't necessarily the center of everything, you know, necessarily back then. But
Arecibo in the north was also a thriving port city.
And Mayagüez as well.
And Mayagüez, exactly.
Yeah.
And as Ponce.
But I wanted to read you from something from well, actually I want to read you from the book. And I wanted to read you a little bit about her childhood first, and then later we'll hear about the massacre. And this is from the first chapter. And I want to just say this book was based on an oral history that Margaret Randall did in the 70s called El Pueblo No Solo es Testigo. And it was published by Ediciones Huracán and had been out of print for decades. And I should also back up and explain that the idea of doing this book in English for English reading people in the United States to know this story, we had that idea. I had that idea right then in 1978. And wow, it sure took a lot. There were many, many failures and many disappointments over the years. And then finally, a few years ago, I said to Margaret, look, we just need to publish it ourselves, which is a very costly and difficult thing, I got to tell you, I've learned. And it has to be bilingual because the Spanish version is not available anymore. I mean, you know, it's like winning the lottery to find a copy of that book that was first published in 1979. So anyway, we decided that we had to do it ourselves and it had to be bilingual. And that whole process, thank you. You know, it took it took 40 years to come up with this book. But anyway, so this is from the first chapter, which is called, It Seems to Me I Didn't Have Much of a Childhood. You might not believe it, but it seems to me I didn't have much of a childhood or even youth. I was born mature. I don't know if you get what I mean. I was born old. I don't remember much of my youth, just the struggles, and the same with my childhood. I'm a working class woman, born in Buenos Aires district of Ponce, April 22nd, 1909. A worker, in spite of having spent a few years in homes that were better off economically after the deaths of my parents. They died almost together. My father, I think, from some disease of the kidneys, and since they were an old-fashioned couple and neither could live without the other, when her husband died, my mother forgot us and went and died too. I was raised away from the rest of my remaining family. They took me to stay with my godmother, a woman who'd married a Spaniard, who I guess you could say was pretty cultured. I used to hear her play the piano. She played quite well. And from the time I was little, I would listen to the works she played. I listened to the older girls when they gathered and recited. So as a little girl, I became aware of the art of reciting. That's the declamadora role that she played so much and so well. And maybe that's why I liked it, why I still like it so much. My godmother had a library where I would choose books by the best poets. I read the Contemplations by Victor Hugo when I was still pretty small, but I understood a bit of it. And then they used to go away in the hot season, July and August, to a beautiful place in the country. I liked nature. I liked to see the trees, the river, everything, as if I could understand it somehow. I learned a couple of poems of Juan de Dios Pesa, the Mexican poet, and when I was alone and nobody could hear, I would recite them. My audience was the river, the trees swept by the wind. That was my favorite audience. I went to school at that time, but not for long. I was bored. The teacher, the discipline, they said later, excuse me for saying this, but they told me later when I was big that I was rebellious because I was intelligent. I don't know about that, but I was bored. I like poems and such best, not arithmetic. Also, because of the Yankee influence in Ponce, the schools began to have mixed classes with boys and girls together. There were problems with that because of people's backgrounds and the imposition of a strange culture without explanation. Of course, it was better for the girls who they let go to school. I got to the fourth grade and they took me out. After that, I studied at home, but just for a short time. My godmother and her husband died shortly thereafter. It was a confusing time, but I understand more about it now. The issue of North American imperialism was in the air. They had a coffee plantation. It was ruined. I later heard Don Pedro explain those setbacks for my people. I believe the North Americans devalued the dollar and people were ruined. Mm-hmm. In the middle of all that, the coffee disaster, the death of that family, I went to live with my brothers, poor people who raised pigs and so forth. I spent my time working with all that. I got malaria because I wasn't used to that kind of life, and the change was so abrupt. I would get chills out in the field and lie down on the ground till they went away. By chance, because of the deaths of my parents, I had lived away from that reality for a time, but that reality is the norm in our countries. How many women, how many men are born and die in that life? How many? That's why I said, I don't really remember having a childhood, just pieces of one. Yes.
Wow.
Yes. So this was the young woman who went on to join the party and begin advocating for women's rights. But one of the things that she did in the interim that is also described in the book is she began to go and read and recite at at factories, at tobacco factories for the workers. And she would also go and listen to what other reciters were reading. And from that, she learned quite a bit about what was happening in the world and different aspects of struggle of the workers. And so she was very much obviously an autodidact who continued her political education her whole life. And then she, as I said, she began to organize around the issue of women, and Albizu supported her proclamation regarding women that was discussed at the 1935 Nationalist Assembly in Caguas. And so she had become a leading figure of women's emancipation within the ranks of the Nationalist Party. And so that brings us up to the massacre, and excuse me. And I want to point out what you were saying earlier about, this extraordinary young woman is she was 27 years old at the massacre. Okay. That's how old she was, going just short of 28, but she was quite a young woman. So she is definitely of the age of people today who need to hear about her. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to read you next, because I know our time is limited, a passage from the chapter called, "So I picked up the flag, all covered in blood, and went on with it." It was Palm Sunday of the year 1937. We left Mayagüez in rented buses. I remember they were red. Through the bus windows, we saw other red buses pass very close, the police buses, and the police were smiling as they went by. Of course, they knew what was about to happen, but we did not. We gathered at the offices of the Nationalist Council. It was 1 p.m. We saw our leaders arguing, coming and going. We learned later they'd gone to the mayor's office because he'd given permission for the demonstration that day, and a quarter of an hour beforehand, he ordered the permit suspended. Finally, our leaders gave the order, and we all set out, women as well as men. And it was agreed that women would not go out, but later they decided we would. Even today, Margaret, we have to fight for our right to struggle. When we formed ranks in the street, the police were there too, in the order they'd planned beforehand. Then, when we were on our way with our flags and all, and a young girl said to me, "Hi, Dominga, look at their guns." Poor thing, she was really scared. I told her, "Yes, I see them, but we have to go forward." I don't mean to claim I wasn't afraid, Margaret. Maybe I was, but more than anything, I was angry. So we went ahead, the cadets of Ponce in front, those of Mayagüez next, and then the women, first those of us of Ponce, and then us with our flags. They ordered the hymn La Borinqueña to be played, and we stood at attention. Then Cadet Lopez de Victoria said, "Eyes front, ready, forward march." When he said this, he did not know what was before us. We marched, and all the guns began to fire. I still don't know, Margaret, what happened that day, why I wasn't killed. I was out in the open, and I heard when they released the safety catches on the machine guns. At that moment, I looked, and I saw a lot of people throw themselves on the ground because from a distance, they were throwing tear gas bombs. I don't know where they came from. I felt strangled. As the bullets kept coming, the people in front kept falling. I didn't look at the police or at who was firing. I was running to save myself when I see someone cross and fall wounded. And in that second, I see the flag on the ground. So I picked up the flag, all covered with blood, and went on with it. I picked it up and went on my way. And then before us, the dead, torn to pieces at our feet. Because they say that there they used for the first time those explosive shells that Mussolini had. A little girl who came to see the demonstration with her parents died too. She was ripped apart by a bullet. Apart from the 22 dead, there were many wounded. One of them, a young man, wrote on the wall with his blood, "Long live the Republic, down with the assassins." We spent the whole afternoon of the massacre in the police station. The entire people were united behind us. Later, there was the Hayes investigation with Mr. Hayes of the American Civil Liberties Union. Mm-hmm. My turn to testify came one day at 2 a.m. The place was packed with people from the university, intellectuals, everyone waiting for their statements. When it was my turn, I just told what I saw exactly and simply, and that I picked up the flag on my way. Then Hayes said, "And why, if you were in danger of death, did you pick up that flag instead of running for your life?" And I answered, "Because my maestro taught me that the flag of the homeland should never fall on the ground." Then he asked me, "Who is your maestro?" And I said, "Dr. Don Pedro Albizu Campos." After that, he would stand up whenever I passed by. And he wrote in the newspaper El Mundo something like this: "You have to see her, young, Black, immutable in her dignity." Mr. Hayes ended his report with the words, "This was a massacre."
Okay.
That's just breathtaking. Breathtaking. I wish that students across the United States would have to read that book, your book, and learn about Dominga, because the history of Puerto Rico under the rule of the United States is right there. That colonization is right there. And it's been, I'm very moved. O sea, this is not just, there's the violent massacre, and then there's the bureaucratic massacre. It's just the way that you can eliminate a people in different ways.
That's right. That's right.
The courage of Dominga is just,
yes.
I am without words.
I'm
so glad you found her.
Yeah.
You found the word.
What do you learn about Mariana that you were not aware of?
I'm sorry?
What do you learn writing this book, making the research about this unique woman in the history of Puerto Rican?
Well, I mean, I learned her story, and honestly, I mean, the months I spent working on this book, I felt like I was spending time with her again. You know, I had those few, a couple of hours with her decades ago, but I just felt like she was with me as a presence, and she still is. You know, I love this woman. She's an extraordinary voice. And as we say on the back of the book, I mean, to me, Dominga, hers is a story of resistance. Dominga de la Cruz leaping into gunfire to retrieve the Puerto Rican flag is Puerto Rico in struggle. To me, she is emblematic of the resistance, the courage, and the bravery.
And that's another thing. When I see Puerto Rican parades and I see that people put our flag on windshield wipers and they think that's adorable, and now even more, don't do that to our flag. It's not adorable. Right. And even knowing Dominga's story makes it even more so. We have to take ourselves much more seriously. People died for us. People put themselves in danger for us. How can we possibly trivialize our history and our flag?
This is a very common strategy of colonial and imperial powers, right? Is erasure and denying and destroying and invisibilizing our history. It happens all the time in the United States as well. And so I think our duty as cultural workers, and that's one of the things I consider myself, is unearthing, is being kind of archaeologists of our revolutionary history, our history of resistance, and putting it forward for people to learn from it, because they're not going to do it. The Department of Education isn't going to do it. The higher ups are not going to do it. We need to insist upon our history and bring it forward and share it and give it the alabanza, give it the praise that it so deserves. I mean, the history of resistance of the Puerto Rican people is breathtaking and so awe-inspiring. And, this is one person, and an extraordinary person, but she's not alone. And when I was working years ago, when I was working on the original, an original introduction to the book, I was very much part of the campaign to free the five. And so I was in touch with Zoraida Collazo, Oscar Collazo's daughter, and she had written to me. She said, talking about the role of women, she said, I'm going to prepare a list of women active in the 1950 revolution and the struggle in general, and you'll be amazed how many unknown names pop up. And so here's the list: Juanita Ojeda, Olga Vizcal, Carmen Pérez, Isolina Rondón, Juanita Mills, Blanca Canales, Doris Torresola, Angelina Torresola, Carmen Otero, Rosa Collazo, Isabelita Rosado, Candida Collazo, Carmen Fernandez, Maria Fernandez. These are just a few to mention. Now, since that time, some of these names have become more known to us, but some of them remain little known.